Everyone. All right. So let's see. First things first. We're going to meet tomorrow and go over your papers. And I'm going to note also that this lecture is going to be shorter because I'll be sending this along with a documentary about Frantz Fanon on YouTube. So we'll have a shorter lecture today. So we're at chapters 4 and 5 in Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks. And just to sort of reiterate, right, we read the first chapter, and we saw in that chapter Fanon responding to sort of series of racial stereotypes, racist remarks, and race ideas, trying to combat sort of the accepted stereotypes and racism of colonialist France, but we could extend that to the United States, to any place where there's racism. So in chapter 4, the so-called dependency complex of colonized people, and then again in chapter 5, the fact of blackness, Fanon is continuing this series of responses to racist ideas. So there's something autobiographical about this book. I think that's one of the sources of its power, is that it is Fanon's own experience, right? It's written in the first person, and we see more so in chapters 4 and 5 than in the first chapter that this is really the story of Fanon grappling with racism, Fanon's own personal experience, trying to sort of come to an understanding of race and racism, and how to fight back against the powers of colonialism, of the colonizer. So in chapter 4, and especially chapter 5, we get this sort of autobiographical, not sort of, account of his own experience with racism. But that experience, his own experience, is informed by his background in psychology. So as he's working through these ideas, he is also thinking about psychology and philosophy. And so it's really kind of, and I think in particular, chapter 5, the fact of blackness, which is a very famous chapter, it's a beautiful mix of these sort of three elements, right, which is the personal memoir, and then the psychology and philosophy. So chapter 4, the so-called dependency complex of colonized peoples, begins with an analysis of another book, right? So it's a continuation of sort of critique of culture, and that is the book Prospero and Caliban, Psychology of Colonization by Octave Manoni, famous French psychologist who wrote this book, Prospero and Caliban, arguing about sort of the historicity of colonization. Right? What are the historical conditions that led to colonization, and what are the psychological factors, of the colonizer and the colonized? And so Fanon is giving this analysis of Prospero and Caliban and critiquing Manoni's analysis. Right? And the first thing he wants to challenge is the idea that there is a kind of inherent inferiority or dependency complex. Right? Remember, in chapter 1, Fanon is analyzing this inferiority complex that is brought about through colonization on the part of the colonized. And now this is a very similar phenomenon, this dependency complex. Right? So what is this idea that the colonized is dependent? What is that dependency? And so the first point of contrast, the first critique Fanon levels against Benoni is the idea that this dependency complex is innate within the colonized person. Sorry, I'm already lost in my notes. Let me just see if I can. So forgive me. Okay, got it. So in general, here is roughly Benoni's argument, which Fanon wants to critique. And the argument is that, I think we touched on this last week also, that colonization is a kind of historical inevitability, and that the colonizer has a kind of inevitable psychology that leads to the conquest of other places, and the colonized has a inherent psychology that makes them sort of naturally suited to being colonized. In other words, the argument is that because of forces of history, the colonized is conditioned to be colonized, right? That it is right and proper to colonize these colonized peoples, right? That Europe should colonize the West Indies, Africa, other places around the world. And so this is, Fanon says this is Benoni trying to be sort of understanding in the sense that he is trying to say there's nothing sort of, the only, it's difficult to articulate because it's so outdated, right? But the idea is, of Benoni's is the colonized person is not subhuman, is not inferior or fundamentally different, right? But they do have this psychology, and that psychology, right? So they're fully human, but the psychology of the native peoples in, say, Martinique, is one that is suited to colonization. Right? So those tribes, what's the right, those savages, right, need someone to guide them, need someone to take care of them, essentially. That's Benoni's point of view. And for Fanon, obviously, this is paternalistic, condescending, and racist, right? The idea being the idea that any group of people has a natural need for a master is preposterous, ridiculous. And the idea that the colonized need a master is racist. But here's the point I wanted to get to. What Fanon thinks Manoni's real failure is on page 86. And this is an important point because um, I think this is one of the moments where Fanon is saying uh, what is needed in order to escape racism. And he writes on 86, I sincerely believe that a subjective experience can be understood by others. And it would give me no pleasure to announce that the black problem is my problem and mine alone, and that it is up to me to study it. But it does not seem to me that Monsieur Manoni has not tried to feel himself into the despair of the man of color confronting the white man. Right? So Monsieur Manoni has not tried to feel himself into the despair of the man of color confronting the white man. So this passage begins with the assertion, right, that a subjective experience can be understood by others. And that the reason why, he goes on, the reason why Manoni is the source of Manoni's racism, the reason why he's able to sort of objectify and pathologize an entire group of people, the colonized people, is because he has failed to truly feel himself into the subjective experience of those people. Right? He is, from the outset, engaging those people as objects, right? As an object to be classified, to be understood scientifically, and right to be categorized and put away, in essence, right? This people has a dependency complex, and therefore colonization is justified and case closed. Fanon says, right, the failure here is that objectification, which is a failure in turn to feel yourself into someone else's subjective experience. What Fanon is talking about here is compassion, right? Compassion, to have a fellow feeling with someone else, right? To have a co-passion. So what is needed in, in race relations generally, but in particular in the attempt to psychoanalyze the colonized people. What's needed is compassion, right? And I think that compassion is not as sort of expressive a word or a way of saying it as Fanon has here. I want to again highlight this idea: feeling himself into the despair of the man of color when confronting the white man. What does this mean? This means put yourself in their shoes. But I like this language because this idea of feeling your way into someone's subjectivity, right? To try to take account of all the different worldly forces that are affecting another human being, right? To really try to understand their motivations, right? Rather than to assume that their motivations are your motivations. And this is really the most important thing. This is what it means to have compassion, true compassion. What it means to treat someone as a sovereign individual, right? To treat someone as an other, right? Is to grant their, is to, right, not assume that they are like you. forgive me, I lost my thought for a second there, right? To not assume that they're like you, to allow them to uh, pursue their own ends, explain themselves, to take their explanations at face value and not, right, assume, uh, well, if I were in that situation, I would do X, Y, and Z. And the fact that they aren't doing X, Y, and Z means that they have some kind of irregularity or disorder or something, right? A dependency complex. Uh, to allow the other to be other, uh, and to attempt to understand what the other as other is feeling, experiencing, rather than to assume that their experience is the same as your experience. And this holds good for all interpersonal relations, right? Every individual is unique. Every individual is particular, and therefore, right, there's some degree of compassion required in any even conversation, right? Any interaction between two people. But it's especially true in, right, conversation, in relations between different races. And the reason for that is what Fanon is articulating throughout this whole book, right? Which is that the world of the colonized is fundamentally different than the world of the colonizer. And that coming from the world of the colonizer, it's easy to assume that the colonized should, right, behave like a colonizer, right, or like the uh, colonized people, the, right, black natives of Martinique, should behave like white people, and to the extent that they aren't behaving like white people, they are deficient. That is what it means to assume that your perspective is the universal perspective, that your subjectivity is a universal subjectivity, universal experience. Right? The world is fundamentally different if you are Austrian 20th century philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein said, the world of the happy is not the same as the world of the unhappy. This is an interesting thought that I think is relevant to Fanon and this whole discussion, that there is no objective world, and that what the world is and what the world means is dependent on your psychological outlook, your experience. You only know the world through your experience. So right, the way the world presents itself is through your experience. And if your experience is good, then the world will appear good. And if your experience is fraught, if you are oppressed, then the world is, right, appears less good, appears oppressive. So we can see, right, for the colonizer, the colonial world is fine. There's no problem. Whereas for the colonized, obviously the colonial world is a horrific crime, right? The annihilation of your sovereignty and your culture. How do you overcome the worldview into which you are born? How do you learn to feel yourself into somebody else's subjectivity? how, if the world appears good to you, can you learn to see what's not good in the world for other people? Um, well, that's the question. Yeah. So one other note I want to make about this, then, is how different this is from the Cartesian idea of reason and the Cartesian idea of the world. Right? For Descartes, the world is universal and objective and is grasped through scientific observation. The subject, the thinking subject, the experiencing subject, is universal, right? Insofar as reason is universal. Logic is true in all cases. Now, we don't have to say that, and in fact, I think we can make the case, as I believe Sartre would, that Fanon's understanding of the world and of reason are in fact in line with Descartes. Insofar as, for Descartes, the subject is nothing more than this discerning judgment which is able to distinguish the true from the false. And the world is nothing more than the set of true things that can be said about physical objects. Right? That definition of subjectivity and that definition of the world are compatible with Fanon's assertion that there are fundamentally subjective experiences and that the world can appear fundamentally different to different people. Because we remember, right, what is it that Descartes is not interested in? He's not interested in received ideas, opinions, the sensory appearance of the world. And above all, he's not interested in your psychology or your happiness. He's ultimately not interested in morality. Right? And what Fanon is interested in is the moral world, the moral subject, right? The subject as a moral subject and a moral object, right? So Descartes and Fanon are compatible, but the point I want to make is that a kind of crude Cartesianism, which would say subjectivity means understanding science, right? Or the universal subjectivity is not merely that faculty for making rational judgments. The universal subjectivity, the subjectivity that is truly a human subjectivity, is the subjectivity that that understands the world scientifically, that has scientific knowledge, and right, that understands itself as this pure rationality. The world is the world of scientific observation. Now, and in this crude Cartesianism, we'd say what it means that the world is the world of scientific observation is the world organized according to certain conventions, for example, clock time, right? Uh, the world is the world. Uh, Clock time is an objective fact of the world, right? In a pure sense, Descartes would have to admit clock time is a matter of opinion. It is an anthropological phenomenon. It is an invention of culture. Uh, so it would be a sort of corruption of the purity of the Cartesian idea to say, well, rationality means uh, having a European sensibility and a European ordering of the world. And anything that doesn't rise to that is deficient, right? Has some kind of complex. All right. Now, let's see. So what Fanon is pushing back against then is not Descartes' philosophy, but the sort of culture that develops out of Descartes, which assumes that the European mind, right, the European philosophy uh, is the only real subjectivity. So, and I just want to highlight again on 92 and 93, another instance where Fanon is making this argument that, as he says in 93, it is the racist who creates his inferior. And this is being leveled against Manoni, right? That by asserting that there is this dependency complex in the colonized, right? That is the original racist gesture, to say this people is inherently dependent, or this people is inherently inferior, right? In the same, by the same token. That categorization is the creation of the idea of that inferiority, that dependency. So this sort of liberal attempt to psychologize, understand, right, the colonized psychology. Fanon is saying this is again just a reinforcement of racist stereotypes, racist ideas. But on that point, right, I think there's something else interesting here on 92, where he's talking about, why this racism continues to crop up, even in those well-meaning liberals who try to, as in the case of Manoni, understand, pathologize, who cast themselves as advocates of the colonized and are ostensibly on their side, right? How does racism continue to crop up in those people? And Fanon says, right, that this racism is part of the collective unconscious. Right? Racism is part of the collective unconscious. Uh, and I think this is a really important point, that racism is not just conscious. It's not that uh, the oppression of colonization happens only through those who are actively and consciously and intentionally degrading and oppressing, uh, and right, uh, calling inferior. Um, it is also uh, all those people who justify, who are complicit in that, even right those who are critical of colonialism have unconsciously adopted all of these stereotypes and myths about the colonized. Right, and this is, uh, I think, the larger point about the analysis of Benoni. Right, is that uh, racism has so permeated and uh, our culture, that one almost, well, one can easily be racist unconsciously without uh, understanding how or why or even that they're being racist. Right? Because racism was for such a long time so completely commonplace and accepted, right? It is ingrained in certain cultural attitudes and cultural institutions and practices. Uh, and those institutions and practices, uh, in turn, breed attitudes and ideas that are then part of the culture and one doesn't even think about. Uh, so this, unconscious racism, again, what do we do about this? How do you get into someone else's mind? I mean, um, but the important point is uh, just the idea that racism can be unconscious, and that unconscious racism, I think that's what he's saying, we have in Benoni, is just as harmful. Right? Um, yeah. All right. So let's think about this then. Right. Um, on page 100. The fact that uh, there is this unconscious racism is an indication that racism is indeed not just an individual, but a structural and cultural phenomenon. In other words, in order to fight racism, it's not enough to find all the individual conscious racists and either punish or convert them. Because even if you found every individual, explicit and conscious racist, and in one way or another, right, excluded them from society or whatever it is, the institutions and the culture would produce new individual explicit racists because of the tacit, right, the tacit racism of cultural institutions. So he writes on 100, what emerges then is the need for combined action on the individual and on the group. Right? As a psychoanalyst, I should help my patient to become conscious of his unconscious and abandon his attempts at a hallucinatory whitening, and also to act in the direction of a change in the social structure. Right? So what's needed is to help the individual, right, become conscious of his unconscious, but also to act in the direction of a change in the social structure. So we have to, according to Fanon, deal with both individuals and social structure. And he emphasizes this again at the bottom. Right? He says, the real source of the conflict, the real source of racism, that is the social structures. So social structures, Fanon believes, are the real source. And he goes on then to describe several dreams of the colonized that illustrate the extent to which racism is produced by culture as an unconscious impulse or belief. Right? And interestingly, right on 104, he says, the discoveries of Freud are of no use to us here. Now, I think what he has in mind is in the way that we're going to analyze, again, the psychology of the colonized. Freud has a kind of one-size-fits-all approach to psychology. And Fanon is arguing, right, people have different psychologies. Moreover, there is not a single sort of constitution of the psyche, right? In the way that Freud thinks, the father is sort of foundation for civilization. No, right? Dreams, our psyches, our psychology is informed by a much more diverse and real set of experiences than this abstract idea about the father. Right? So, for example, on 106, when he writes, the rifle of the Senegalese soldier is not a penis, but a genuine rifle, he's attacking this Freudian idea, right? Everything can be reduced to sex. Your fear of the rifle is about your fear of, the rifle represents a penis, and the penis represents your fear of your father and your inability to, perform masculinity or whatever. Fanon's saying, no, right? What bullshit, right? What you're afraid of is not your father. You're afraid of a rifle, right? So, I think what he's getting at here is, just like Manoni, Freud is someone who wants to sort of reduce the colonial experience to a universal experience, right? We all have the same subjectivity. We all live in the same world. And we can all understand each other perfectly well. No, right? There is no universal structure of psychology, and an analysis of the psychology of the colonized would require a different framework than the Freudian one, right? It would require doing away with those European assumptions. All right, so let's move on to chapter 5, and we're pushing it a little bit on time, but we'll see how far we get. Now, there's some really interesting claims in chapter 5, the fact of blackness. Really, it's in this chapter that he does a lot of heavy lifting. So let's start. I came into the world imbued with the will to find a meaning in things. My spirit filled with the desire to attain to the source of the world. And then I found that I was an object in the midst of other objects. Okay, so right off the bat, right? I came into the world imbued with the will to find a meaning in things. My purpose, my nature is to look for meaning, to seek meaning. What is the obstacle to finding meaning? And he already lays it out here in the first paragraph. Right? Objectification. What prevents us from finding meaning is becoming objectified. This objectification is, of course, right, the objectification of racism, of colonization. So he says, sealed into that crushing objecthood, I turn beseechingly to others. Right? And here he begins this long, or the chapter, which is a series of reflections on what to do about this objectification, how to escape objectification. And right, I should mention, this escape from objectification is, again, a personal journey. He's not laying out in this book any kind of framework, political or social, for escaping that in general, right? This is a personal journey. So he writes, again, this is on page 109, as long as the black man is among his own, he will have no occasion, except in minor internal conflicts, to experience his being through others. There is, of course, the moment of being for others, of which Hegel speaks, but every ontology is made unattainable in a colonized and civilized society. Okay, so a couple of observations here, right? First of all, as long as the black man is among his own, he will not experience his being through others. And this is a concept of otherness, right? Of what sort of proper meaning of an other is. And the other is the one that gives you some new sense of your own being. In some cases, that might be very positive. In other cases, very negative. Obviously, in this case, right, the other is the colonizer. So the other is kind of terror, right? And they don't give you your own being in the way that, for example, the other in a romantic relationship would give you your own being, in a positive way. They give you a being, which means, right, they hold on to your being, erase your being, and impose a new being on you, right? It's a violent way of imposing being. So the other lays a kind of claim over you, uh, and that claim is an oppressive one. So we also then get this sense of these two different worlds: the world of the colonized, the world of the colonizer. Right? So within one's own world, one doesn't get one's being through others. One is not conscious of getting one's being through others. It's only when one comes in contact with someone from the other world that one experiences one's being coming from someone else. Um, yeah. And then, right, this interesting and strange comment: every ontology is made unattainable in a colonized and civilized society. So, an ontology means ontology is the study of being, uh, to ontos in Greek, and and that ontology is referring to these worlds: the world of the colonizer, the world of the colonized. Uh, Ontology, you read Psalm 110, does not permit us to understand the being of the black man. Ontology does not permit us to understand the being of the black man. And he's talking about the ontology of European philosophy, study of being in philosophy. And this is a very interesting claim. What he's saying is that the black experience lies outside the bounds of European philosophy. European philosophy cannot grasp the experience of the colonized, the experience of an other culture. Right? Ontology is about being within the world of the colonizer. And everything within the being of the colonizer can be explained through ontology, the study of being in general. But, right, because that ontology, that way of knowing and understanding, comes from and is contained within European culture, that ontology doesn't know what to make of a world that comes up out of a different culture, different people, and different historical experience. So what Fanon is saying is no philosophy is able to reduce the world of the colonizer and the world of the colonized to a single universal world. That I had a philosophy professor in my undergraduate program who is a black guy from Philadelphia. His name's Kevin Miles. Great guy. And he used to say, philosophy doesn't do work on racism. Racism does work on philosophy. Or philosophy doesn't do work on race. Race does work on philosophy. And that's a very Fanon way of understanding the relationship between philosophy and colonization and race, which is to say, we cannot force the Black experience, Black culture to fit into, to be reducible to European ontology, European philosophy. Instead, right, if there's any, if European philosophy wants to be what it says it is, which is a universal discipline, universal ideas, instead, right, European philosophy needs to be reworked and worked over in order to make space for the otherness, the difference of Black experience, of the colonized experience, of non-European experience, and of non-European worlds. That European philosophy is chauvinistic in the sense that it refuses to allow anything to exist that it is not going to master. Right? European philosophy, ontology in general, wants to master all being. Right? Ontology, the study of being in general. What that means is to have an understanding of everything that is. That is the sort of crude Cartesianism I was mentioning before. And that is a philosophy, the desire, the philosophical desire to have kind of mastery over all of being, in the sense of having knowledge of all of being, understanding of all of being. That is itself a kind of colonization, right? It doesn't allow for other interpretations. It is always going to reduce the other to itself. And this is what we see in chapter 5. Right? All these attempts on Fanon's part to assert independence, to say, right, I am not dependent on the colonizer, on colonization, on Europe, that I am a representative of Black culture, and Black culture is fundamentally different and can't be reduced to European culture, right? It is its own thing, right? That is sort of the message of Black power and Black pride that we get from Fanon, right? This is what Fanon is searching for, right? Source of identity that isn't filtered through this European philosophy. Okay. So, why is for Fanon, Black experience fundamentally different, ontologically irreducible to the white experience? Let's read on a little bit. So ontology does not permit us to understand the being of the Black man. For not only must the Black man be Black, he must be Black in relation to the white man. The Black man has no ontological resistance in the eyes of the white man. Right? That idea, ontological resistance, is sovereignty. right, is the ability to say, I am, and my being is uh, the source of all being. My being is uh, coincidental with being in general. My being is a proper being. Right? That's sovereignty. My being is a proper being. My being cannot be subordinated to your being. And that's the whole idea. That power to subordinate is not just a physical power. It's not just a psychological power. It's also a philosophical power, right? And it occurs through philosophy. To say, you are not your own thing. In fact, you fit into my schema. So that sovereign blackness, which is not defined just in relation to whiteness, that is what would give ontological resistance, right? And again, I think when we think of the Million Man March or something, right? Think of those images of African Americans carrying signs that say, I am a man. That is ontological resistance. That is the assertion of one's own being. Right? I don't care if you have a definition of manhood. I have my own definition. I don't need your definition in order to determine if I'm a man. Right? I'm a man because I say I'm a man. And forgive me for falling into the, the gendered language here, right? The 1950s, but right, I'm a person. I'm a human being, and I don't care what your definition of human being is. I don't have to refer to your definition. I have my own definition. That's ontological resistance. Overnight, right, the Negro has been given two frames of reference within which he has had to place himself. His metaphysics, or less pretentiously, his customs and the sources on which they were based, were wiped out because they were in conflict with a civilization that he did not know and that imposed itself on him. Right? So the original ontology of a colonized people, which is undergirded by a metaphysics, which is to say a culture, a set of customs, right? Its own civilization, right? And the ontology that would grow out of that civilization. The most sort of horrific and effective crime of colonization is to annihilate that culture. Right? Because to annihilate that culture is to make all people, right, is to annihilate the source of that ontological resistance, annihilate that being that gives dignity, that gives meaning to a person. Without that ontological foundation, without that culture, there's kind of an inevitability that a people will become dependent on the civilization that wiped out their civilization. Right? There's no alternative. So Fanon will say it's ridiculous to say that this dependency is inherent in the people. All people are dependent on their culture, on their civilization. It's their culture and civilization that gives them the meaning of their lives. And when that is wiped out, uh, you know, you have to find some kind of culture. And so this is sort of the post-colonial dilemma that Fanon analyzes elsewhere. Does the formerly colonized person uh, simply try to assimilate into European culture to find the source of meaning in the culture of the colonizer? Or does the formerly colonized person attempt to create their own new culture and civilization to give some ontological resistance to the colonizing culture? Uh, so let's let's continue on page 110 and return to that question that I asked. I mean, so everything I've already said speaks to the way in which the Black experience, the colonized experience, is fundamentally different than the white experience. Right? To have gone through the annihilation of culture, that subjugation and oppression, is fundamentally to have a different psychological experience of the world. But it's not just psychological, it's also physical. So on 110, and then the occasion arose when I had to meet the white man's eyes. Right? So this is hearkening back to that moment in chapter 4 that I spent some time on, right? Thinking about the idea of feeling yourself into someone else's subjective experience. And what Fanon specifically says is, right, what Benoni fails to do is feel his way into the Black experience before the white man's eyes, right? The confrontation with the white man, what that experience is. He says, an unfamiliar weight burdened me. The real world challenged my claims. In the white world, the man of color encounters difficulties in the development of his bodily schema. In the white world, the man of color encounters difficulties in the development of his bodily schema. He says more about that on the next page. Consciousness of the body is a solely negating activity. Let's read his explanation of this on 111. The body is surrounded by an atmosphere of certain uncertainty. I know that if I want to smoke, I shall have to reach out my right arm and take the pack of cigarettes lying at the other end of the table. The matches, however, are in the drawer on the left, and I shall have to lean back slightly. And all these movements are made not out of habit, but out of implicit knowledge, a slow composition of myself as a body in the middle of a spatial and temporal world. Such seems to be the schema. It does not impose itself on me, it is rather a definitive structuring of the self and of the world, definitive because it creates a real dialectic between my body and the world. What Fanon is describing here is sort of phenomenological understanding of embodiment, what it means to have a body, what it means to be in the world. It means to have a certain kind of schema, right? My being is a schema, a sort of a dialectic between my body and the world. And it means literally just my ability to sort of be in the world, to operate within the world freely, to be comfortable in the world. This schema, this bodily schema, is interrupted. Right? Racism interrupts even sort of the most basic, fundamental physical ability to be in the world. Now, this emphasis on the body is important. And it's something that in the role of the body, the idea of the body, plays an important role in another important book, much more recent than Fanon, which is Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, which I recommend, where he talks about the way that racism reduces Black subjectivity to simple corporeality, into bodily existence, right? That the effect of racism is to turn the object of racism into a mere body, right? And to sort of look to their body. Their body is what holds the meaning of their being, rather than their soul or their mind or their behavior, their psychology. And so that objectification of racism is, literally achieved through emphasizing and sort of over-determining, as Sartre will say, the physicality of the oppressed person, of the objectified person. This objectification is literal here, the over-determining of the meaning of the body. We hear about objectification, in terms of sexism a lot also. I think it's a similar experience, right? That, the meaning and value of a woman is loaded into her body. The subjectivity, the sort of potential of a woman is determined in her body, and that is one of the effects, one of the means of objectification. And the same is true in racism, right? That the value and meaning of the person is located in the body, in corporeality. Right? That's objectification. So he writes on 112, the corporeal schema crumbled, its place taken by a racial epidermal schema. Right? He's describing this experience of, walking around in France and having white children point at him and say nasty things, right? Express fear at him. The experience of a Black person in the white world is the experience of, as Fanon is describing it here, right? Being unable to hide, right? Having your body is this, in the first place, right? The inability to hide. And then the fact that your body has been transformed into a predetermined signifier, right? That's what I think this means. the corporeal schema crumbled, its place taken by a racial epidermal schema. The way that physical being in the world gets disrupted is that one isn't able to disappear into the world, right? When a black person is with other black people in a group of people of color, there is an easiness, Fanon says, that doesn't exist when a person of color goes into the white world. And the same is true. I think the dynamics are certainly different, but I mean, just as a kind of psychological fact, I think the same is true for a white person going into a majority or all black room or country or whatever, right? There's this sort of sense of being extremely visible when you are with your own, right? When you are not with the others, right? What you would define as an other. You can disappear into the world. You don't think about what you do with your hands. You don't think about reaching for a pack of cigarettes and getting your matches. You just are. You behave. You behave the way you are. Right? But then to enter into this racially charged situation, one is observed in a different way. And one of Fanon's points is just that the chapter is called "The Fact of Blackness," that this is an unavoidable experience for the colonized person, whereas it is very much an avoidable experience for many white people, and also an avoidable experience for those groups who are also oppressed but are less visibly other. Right? So Fanon talks about the Jews for a while toward the end of this chapter, and I mean, this is an interesting topic, but he'll say Jewish people are able to pass as white. They are white, right? Whether we agree that Jews are white or not is another discussion. But Fanon says Jewish people are essentially white, even though they aren't part of the same history. And in any case, they can pass. Right? They don't immediately draw attention just by the fact of being. And that's what Fanon is talking about, right? The unavoidableness, the inevitability of being observed. And not just that one is observed, but that one's body is already interpreted, right? That simply by being seen, all these people, these white people on this train that he's describing, are judging him, right? They are thinking things about him. So he says, I was responsible at the same time for my body, my race, for my ancestors. I subjected myself to an objective examination. I discovered my blackness, my ethnic characteristics, and I was battered down by tom-toms, cannibalism, the intellectual deficiency, fetishism, racial defects, slave ships, and above all, show good eating. Right? So what I said, right? Meaning is deposited in the body. That is racism, subjectification. And what is posited there all of these racial stereotypes. Right? So just by going out on the street, Fanon is saying, right, one invites others to judge you. Right? One feels the weight not just of themselves, but of and their own being, but of their race and their ancestors. Right? So what is this list? Right? Battered down by tom-toms, cannibalism, intellectual deficiency, fetishism, etc. Right? All of these stereotypes are oppressive. Right? Just the experience of being observed, Fanon says, right, raises all of these this oppressive sense of what those judgments are. And so I just want to mention then also one other thing here, which is this idea that what Fanon is saying, right, is by having black skin, he is made to account, made to consider his whole race and his ancestors. Because of racism, but because of the essentialization of all those people and all the misconceptions of African culture, African history, which Fanon will talk about in just a moment. But what I want to try and get to is this idea that you hear very often from white people when it comes to racism, race relations, right? A white person will say, I'm not my ancestors. I'm not responsible for what my ancestors did. Right? I am free of this. I'm not a race. I bear no responsibility. And I just think it's interesting to think about, what Fanon is saying is that is unavoidable in the Black experience. Right? It's unavoidable that a person's judgment about your ancestors is going to color their judgment about you. That the fact of Blackness is the fact of having a certain ancestry, a certain history, and that one is therefore unable to escape that. Now, it would seem that Fanon thinks, for now, that it would be good to escape that. Right? That's not going to be his ultimate conclusion. But I guess I wonder why the desire to escape that ancestry is from a white perspective, right, is obvious. To not be associated with enslaving and all the horrors of slavery and colonization. I guess I just wanted to raise that parallel, right? This idea that Fanon is raising, that ancestry cannot be avoided. Right? That racism insists that ancestry accounted for. Uh, and it would seem to me, I guess, that the unconscious racist, and many racists, even conscious ones, maybe, uh, is the one who believes the story about uh, African ancestry, all those stereotypes, which Fanon will go on to say are not true. Uh, Cannibalism, um, witch doctors, all of that. Believes that story about African ancestry, believes that it is important, but then also doesn't believe that their own ancestry is important. Right? It's that ability to escape one's own ancestry while pegging someone else's ancestry to them that is problematic, to say the least. So this whole idea of the body presents sort of fundamental experience of the world that is inaccessible to white people. White people can't know what this experience is like. Not even, right, in the situation I just mentioned, right? If you're a white person in an all black country or all black room, there will be perhaps the interruption in your bodily schema in the sense that you will be observed and you will be tied to your ancestry. But right, the meaning of that ancestry is really different. Right? The meaning of that ancestry is generally valued rather than devalued. So Fanon then goes on this discussion of the way in which this this embodiment is oppressive. Right? Now I want to just mention on page 114, right, all this whiteness that burns me. Right? I sit down at the fire and become aware of my uniform. I had not seen it is indeed ugly. I stop there, for who can tell me what beauty is? Now, I want to mention that line because I think that beauty is an important idea here, and will relate back again to that idea of ontological resistance. To say, right, I'm a man, is to say, right, I am good and I am beautiful. It is to determine one's own value, to determine one's values. And it's in determining those values that one gets meaning. But in any case, right, this blackness, the fact of blackness is this unavoidable experience that shades everything. Right? So it says on 116, when people like me, they tell me it is in spite of my color. When they dislike me, they point out that it's not because of my color. Either way, I am locked into the infernal cycle. Everything returns back to the fact of blackness, to blackness. So it is, right, Fanon is describing this inability to be independent, to be sovereign, to be something that isn't defined, uh, you know, in relation to whiteness. That everything becomes filtered through race for him. Uh, so, trying to make sense of this, Fanon begins reading books. He reads Sir Alan Burns's Color Prejudice, 1948. Very up to date for today, I'm sure. But I want to mention this because it ties into some of our other themes in this class. Color prejudice, writes Sir Alan Burns, is nothing more than the unreasoning hatred of one race for another. Now, why do I mention this, right? Well, I was interested, I was pleased in rereading this to see right, the idea of unreason come up here. And I think it's very interesting, right, that racism is described as unreason. Now, Fanon's response to this, right, is okay. The first takeaway for Fanon is, yes, right. What this is, this oppression, this feeling of alienation, objectification, is hatred, right? As Burns says, an unreasoning hatred. Right? Fanon writes, I had read it rightly. It was hate. I was hated, despised, detested, not by the neighbor across the street or my cousin on my mother's side, but by an entire race. I was up against something unreasoned. Right? The psychoanalysts say that nothing is more traumatizing for the young child than his encounters with what is rational. I would personally say that for a man whose only weapon is reason, there is nothing more erotic than contact with unreason. So, to begin with, Fanon here is saying racism is unreason, kind of madness, right? And reason is a tool of anti-racism. So what do we do with this unreason? If it's not rational, if it's unconscious, produced by structures, and irrational, how can it be combated? How can it be confronted? Right? Reason doesn't do it. So he says, the unreason of it is a problem, but even rationality is not a sure bet to overcome racism. Right? It's on 120. In the abstract, there was agreement. The Negro is a human being. That is to say, amended the less firmly convinced that, like us, he has his heart on the left side. But on certain points, the white man remained intractable. Under no conditions did he wish any intimacy between the races. And so this is, right, the way that rational argument can only get so far. It's abstract concession that of racial equality. Right? Well, but what does that equality really mean? Well, we all have our organs in the same places. Right? It has nothing to do with, again, the moral world. That is a kind of Cartesian, again, right? A strictly, purely Cartesian assertion. Equality, yeah, right? We all have two arms and our hearts on the left side. There's no moral commensurability between the two. That is not real equality. And then, right, even having admitted that abstract equality, uh, that abstract equality isn't true equality. You can see that because, right, miscegenation, interracial marriage is still illegal. Right? That's the real objection. Yeah. So next, right, we know that Fanon spends the early years trying to become white, wishing to be white, wishing to become invisible. Right, the fact of blackness makes that impossible. The way of European philosophy makes that impossible. What he finds is, right, exclusion may be justified. That is to say, the oppression of the colonized, the oppression of Black people, may be justified, but it's not rational. The exclusion is for the sake of the exclusion, right? And rationality, philosophy, everything is put into the service of that exclusion. The exclusion is desired and pursued by white people because of the economic and cultural benefits that it provides to white people. And so all the mechanisms of culture, none of them are strong enough to fight this oppression, because the oppression has a material motivation, which is the enrichment of white people and the assertion of cultural superiority. And so Fanon will conclude, right, in other books, particularly in Wretched of the Earth, that this is why the only way to confront this oppression is through revolution, through violence, through physical confrontation. The oppression cannot be reasoned out of. There has to be the threat, at least, of violence. So let's read on 128. Fanon is now beyond the stage of wishing to be white and is now wishing to assert himself, as he says, as this is on page, in fact, quite early on, 115, right, to assert myself as a Black man. Right? I resolved, since it was impossible for me to get away from an inborn complex, to assert myself as a Black man. Since the other hesitated to recognize me, there remained only one solution: to make myself known. Right? So, what is this ontological being that is going to make himself known in the assertion of Black identity for Fanon? And on page 126 and 27, we get some idea of this. The bottom of 126. Yes, we are, we Negroes, backward, simple, free in our behavior. That is because for us, the body is not something opposed to what you call the mind. We are in the world, and long live the couple, man and earth. Besides, our men of letters help me to convince you. Your white civilization overlooks subtle riches and sensitivity. And then he quotes Leopold Senghor, emotive sensitivity. Emotion is completely Negro as reason is Greek. Right? And Senghor then quotes Langston Hughes. I have known rivers, ancient dark rivers. My soul has grown deep like the deep rivers. Right? Back to Senghor. The very nature of the Negro's emotion, of his sensitivity, furthermore, explains his attitude toward the object perceived with such basic intensity. Right? It is an abandon that becomes need, an active state of communion, indeed, of identification, uh, a rhythmic attitude. The adjective should be kept in mind. Right? So, right, different from the white identity. Uh, it is, right, on the one hand, owning sort of what the white people say uh, about the black people, right? Backward, simple, free in behavior, right? Those are sort of negative stereotypes. And Fanon is saying, in order to assert myself, I embraced those, and I found those to be rather than ugly. I said those are good. Rather than bad, I said they're good. Rather than ugly, I said they're beautiful. Right? The reason, right, that Fanon says, don't feel sort of the reason why I'm able to embrace this is because I'm not a European. I don't come from this Cartesian tradition that separates mind and body. I can be free of this European philosophy that says I am just a thinking thing and I have to ignore my body. Right? No. And this is something that you hear. This was an idea in the 60s, I guess, and I think still is to some extent now. You find this also in James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time, which is also a really great book that I strongly recommend. He says, the world of African Americans is a sensuous world, a world of sort of aesthetic enjoyment, a world of emotional fullness and pleasure, right? Enjoyment, right? And Baldwin will go on to say, white people have lost their ability to enjoy the world, right? To enjoy, right, as Fanon says, to be in the world. Right? We are in the world. Baldwin will say, white people have lost their ability to replenish themselves at the fountain of their own being. What a beautiful phrase, right? To replenish yourself at the fountain of your own being. And so the idea would be, right, the white world is one of this Cartesian mindset. Right? We're going to reduce it to simply ideas. We're going to reduce it to measurements. We're going to reduce ourselves to sort of logical operations. And by contrast, right, the black world, the world of the oppressed and the colonized, would be a world that's free of that Cartesian look, right? That is not one that denies physical pleasure, that denies desires of the body, that denies the importance of the physical world, of sensory experience. It would be one that embraces all of that enjoys and takes pleasure in all of that. And so that in sort of embracing, the opposite, that is a kind of freedom, right? An assertion of identity. He writes on 128, right? The white man wants the world. He wants it for himself alone. He finds himself predestined. Master of this world. He enslaves it. An acquisitive relationship is established between the world and him. And there exist other values. An acquisitive relation is established between the world and him. Right? The white culture sees the world as one of investigation, interrogation, and finally acquisition, and sees themselves as the predestined master. Right? Descartes says, if we follow my method, we will become masters and commanders of nature. Precisely that. But he says, but there exist other values that fit my forms. I am different. I have different values. I don't have to participate in this European view of the world. So he says, between the world and me, a relation of coexistence was established. And so he's saying the alternative that Black culture wants to offer is coexistence between myself and the world, rather than a relationship of domination and mastery. Now, this in turn becomes a kind of problem that Fanon, uh, in continuing to sort of investigate, think about this problem, he sees that there's again a sort of challenge from the white world to this idea. It's not that this idea is not right. It's that the white world, again, is going to attempt to deny that world to him, to deny the validity of that, and again, to reduce that world to the white world, to make those black values, in fact, white values, to appropriate those values. So, in fact, those are our values. So, one of the, I want to point this out, it's interesting, on 129, Fanon's talking about sort of the problem with this way of thinking. I made myself the poet of the world. The white man had found a poetry in which there was nothing poetic. The soul of the white man was corrupted, and, as I was told by a friend who was a teacher in the United States, the presence of the Negroes beside the whites is in a way an insurance policy on humanness. When the whites feel that they have become too mechanized, they turn to the men of color and ask them for a little human sustenance. Right? So, I think that this is interesting. I mean, what Fanon is describing here now is that the way that even this independence becomes a kind of tool of white culture, right? I just think that's a really sort of disturbing observation that is very interesting, right? When the whites feel in the United States that they have become too mechanized, they turn to the men of color and ask them for a little human sustenance. And so, it's not that conception of the meaning of black culture or colonized culture is wrong. It's that articulation of black culture is then immediately, again, appropriated and used by white culture. It becomes an appendage of white culture, and it becomes a kind of benefit even to white culture, right? And I mean, I think at the very least, let's say, that liking black culture, right, is not evidence that you are not racist. That, in fact, right, this idea that that there's more humanity in black culture, which, I think there's a lot to be said for that. There's a lot, there are good arguments to be made for that. But to think about the way that by thinking about black culture in any particular way, one has already essentialized it, and by essentializing it, has already made it then vulnerable to further exploitation and use by uh, the oppressive culture. Um, so he writes, I soon had to change my tune, right? Because not only does this provide something for white culture, but also this doesn't actually set um, Black culture apart as an independent ontological resistance. And he says, talking to uh, another white man explained to me, uh, your properties have been exhausted by us. We have had earth mystics, such as you will never approach. Study our history, and you will see how far this fusion has gone. Then I had the feeling that I was repeating a cycle. My originality had been torn out of me. I wept a long time, and then I began to live again. Right, so there is again the way that white culture has to reduce Black culture to itself. So that's not particular to you, right? White people have that also. Um, that's a stage in history that we've progressed out of. And it's this denial of sovereignty, denial of ontological legitimacy, denial of an identity that is not given by white people. That is, I think, really what Fanon's hammering home here, right? The denial of Black independence in so many different ways. And then so, right, the next thing that Fanon does is start learning about African history. He learns that, this whole idea that African cultures were so, underdeveloped compared to European cultures, that this is not really true, right? He writes on 130, accounts of learned Blacks, doctors of theology who went to Mecca to interpret the Quran. All of that exhumed the past, spread with its insides out, made it possible for me to find a valid historic place. The white man was wrong. I was not a primitive, not even a half man. I belonged to a race that had already been working in gold and silver 2,000 years ago. Right, so finding sort of pride and identity in this history that was denied to Black people. Again, this denial of identity, denial of ability to self-determine, not just in political ways, but philosophically, psychologically, in terms of your own person. That's what's going on here, and part of that denial is the denial of history. There is no history. Africa has no history. There is no, we're not going to teach African history. We're going to say our ideology, our rhetoric is there is no history in Africa, and therefore you have no history and you have no civilization or culture. Fanon is saying that's all a lie. Right? There is African history. There's African civilization. There's stages of development in African civilization. So this denial of identity is very deep. So finally he says, right, he goes and asks Sartre about all of this. Sartre also says, we asked a friend, Sartre, who's normally good, Sartre, who wrote the introduction to Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. They were friends. They were to the movement for creating a Black culture and Black identity, this ontological resistance. And Sartre's response is, Black identity still defines itself against white identity. And he describes it in this Hegelian way, right? That Black identity takes white identity as its thesis and establishes itself as the antithesis, right? As an anti-racist racism, right? So there's white racism, and in order to fight white racism, we have to have an anti-racist racism, right? We reject white people because of their racism. He says, but even that identity is dependent on right? White racism. It's not really independent, and it aims for the synthesis that would destroy both the racism and the anti-racist racism, and would result in, racism-free society. So even Sartre, Fanon says, wants to deny that there is this independence. He wants to say, yes, this development of Black identity that you're engaged in philosophically, well, that's all well and good, but it's ultimately still reducible to European philosophy, European history. It's part of the European story. It's not your own story. Right? So again, even Sartre is going to deny this identity. So he concludes, right? I wanted to rise, but the disemboweled silence fell back upon me, its wings paralyzed, without responsibility, straddling nothingness and infinity. I began to weep. Without responsibility, straddling nothingness and infinity, I began to weep. All right, so we ended up going for the full hour and 15 minutes, so I will not give you a video. Just as well. All right, see you tomorrow.